Afternoon. I think we'll just get started because we've got a lot to get through in the next hour. So thank you for joining us. My name is Heather Gray and I'm the Head of Physiotherapy and Paramedicine at Glasgow Caledonian University. And I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar today. This webinar is the second in a series of 4 professional development events that we have as part of QEA Scotland's collaborative cluster on student mental wellbeing and the curriculum. This is a continuation of the successful cluster that we ran last year. And this year we have a focus on our BAME and LGBTQ+ student learner communities. So today we're delighted to have 2 inspiring speakers joining with us. First of all, we're going to hear from Nicoll Baines from the University of Edinburgh, and she's going to be focusing her presentation on our LGBTQ+ STEM learner communities. Then we're going to hand over to Lara Lalemi from the University of Bristol, whose presentation will speak to our BAME learner communities within STEM. So we'll have some opportunities, not too much time, but some opportunities for questions after each of their presentations. So please, if you put your questions in the chat function, we'll collect those and pose some to the presenters afterwards. Also, feel free to also use the chat function to highlight any resources that you feel might help others, and we can also add these to the resources that we're collating and posting on our Collaborative Cluster website. And finally, we're going to be recording the session, which also records the chat, just for your noting, and we'll make it available afterwards on the QEA Scotland cluster website after the webinar. And for those of you who are using Twitter, the hashtag for today, we'll also put that in the chat, is #ThemesWellbeing, all one word. And if I could just please remind you to keep your mics muted during the session, that'd be great. And without any further delay from me, I'm going to hand over to Katie. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, and thank you everyone that's joining us today. I'm really happy to be here. I'll just make sure I'm on the right slide screen. There we go. So yes, I am going to be presenting you today some introductory areas for consideration when thinking about the well-being of your LGBTQ+ student communities. I'm going to start first of all by telling you a little bit about myself and why I'm here today. You'll notice that I am using subtitles. This is with a view to making my presentation more accessible, but I'm also conscious that sometimes people find subtitles distracting. I'm not going to turn them off, but I will recommend you do a sort of an offline edit, and you can put a piece of paper along the bottom of your screen and that will block it out, but you'll still be able to see the slides and hear my voice. And if you do have any problems, I can see the chat box at the moment, so if anyone isn't able to hear me or I disconnect for some reason, please just alert on there. So yes, I am here today to tell you a bit about LGBT learner communities. This has come from my own experience as a queer woman and as somebody who's been both a learner and an educator, a researcher, and now an academic developer in universities. So I've built my teaching experience in my time at the University of Dundee and then at the University of Leeds. And alongside this, and for around a decade now, I've also been involved in student and mental health support, both as a service volunteer with the Nightline Association and also as a coordinator, trainer and policy officer, developing resources for how to support student wellbeing broadly, but with a particular focus on LGBT+ students and also around support to do with gender-based violence. I currently work in the Institute for Academic Development at the University of Edinburgh and also in the School of Chemistry on a project called Evidence Base, which is focused on inclusive culture and understanding barriers to career progression. So this is very much at the research end of the university spectrum, but we talk a lot about designing curriculum and how staff influence the culture for their colleagues and also for students. Alongside my work, I am the co-chair of the Staff Pride Network for LGBT+ colleagues and allies at the University of Edinburgh. And I also support an initiative called the STEM Village, which is a community collective of STEM researchers who identify as members of the LGBTQ+ community that are committed to raising the visibility of LGBTQ+ people in STEM. We do a lot of great work around conferences, and I'll talk about that later on in the presentation. So my approach to this work is a very systemic one. And I think this is really important when we think about well-being, is that we're not trying to fix individual people, but we're trying to understand the culture of an organization in order to make it a better place for everybody to be and in order for everybody to thrive. So this is the model that I apply to this way of understanding systems, and we call it the Iceberg Tool for systemic thinking. And so just briefly as an overview, what we mostly understand, what most people see, and if you use the iceberg as an analogy here, is the tip. We see what's happened, we see what people experience, we might experience it ourselves. But that's really just a very small portion of what is understood about a system. There's a lot more below the surface going on. So there's patterns and trends, things that happen over time that may influence the events. There are structural elements that support the patterns and influence the relationship between the different elements. And at the very bottom of the iceberg, this root and core is related to the mental models that we all hold. And this is sort of about our assumptions and beliefs about the systems that we operate in, and how we keep those beliefs in place. And actually, in order to change systems, we really need to address all elements of this process in order to make things a better place for everybody. There are obviously different factors that influence the system and are involved in the system, and I've come up with a bit of a schematic overview of all the different things that come into play when we're thinking about higher education organisations. So there's obviously individuals, our students and staff in the organisations. There's the institution itself and its policies and procedures and how it operates. There's the relationship to funding organisations that dictate what's possible at our institutions. And there's also the government that comes into play. So the government has a huge influence on how funding goes to organisations and how it might be spent. There's a global and international aspect to pay attention to. Most higher education institutions don't exist in isolation in their single country. We attract students from all over the world. And so we have a responsibility to understand this dimension too. And more recently, I've added the concept of crisis to this model. And I'm sure everybody can understand why this is necessary, because crisis has such a big influence on how we experience systems and cultures. And the way in which the COVID pandemic, we have seen it disproportionately affects different groups of people, and the way in which you access resource in a crisis is hugely influenced by who you are and what your dimensions are. And all of this basically comes together to form the community of the system. And it's not simple. Everything relates to each other. There's connections and interactions. And it can be really challenging to try and address problems within a system when we don't have these ways of sort of breaking it down. So hopefully that's a good introduction to these concepts. And I'm going to use this as a basis for explaining how we understand challenges faced by LGBTQ+ learners and how we can potentially address them and create better cultures that are more supportive and holistic towards LGBT+ people. So using the iceberg model, first of all, we're thinking about what has happened, what events exist. And these are just some examples of the kind of things that are experienced by LGBT+ young people. They have high rates of poor mental health, self-harm and suicide than their non-LGBT+ counterparts. This is data taken from a very extensive report from Student Minds, which is another student mental health organisation. These are some statistics from LGBT Youth Scotland that show how LGBT and trans youth have very high rates of experiencing bullying in school, and they're very, very likely to have experienced mental health problems or associated behaviours. And so all of this is adding to the kind of pressures that they're experiencing when they're going through their very high pressure environment of a university. In STEM specifically, there is a significant underrepresentation of LGBT+ people. There's also a real lack of actual data and understanding these problems, particularly in the UK. And this data that I've included here is from the survey of US federal agencies that showed a 20% less representation of LGBT+ people in their organisations. And we're only very recently in the last couple of years starting to gather this data about organisations in the UK, and reporting is still quite limited. There is information coming out of the Wellcome Trust culture surveys that show how only a very small proportion of LGBTQ+ staff feel comfortable being open about their sexuality at work. And this plays into a lot of rhetoric around sexuality not necessarily being a topic of conversation that you would bring to the workplace. In terms of the patterns and trends that have existed over time, like I said, there's very limited data in this area. And from the Office of Students, we've got data going back to around 2015 that shows a very steady but small increase in the number of LGBT plus people reporting their identity as part of the student population. So it's going from around 4% in 2015 to around 6 to 7% in 2019. Now, this is a very small increase. You can also see that there are a considerable portion of people who don't respond to this information. And this can be for a variety of reasons. Sometimes people don't feel safe declaring their sexuality. Sometimes people might not want to. And it's also something that's not necessarily fixed. And so it might change over time related to that. So yeah, we need better information to understand our communities. But hopefully one of the big messages you're getting from this is that LGBTQ plus students do exist and their experiences are real, and they're something that we must be thinking about when designing how we interact with them. In terms of the underlying structures, there's a lot of things that have influenced our inclusion and the welcomingness of a culture towards LGBT plus people over the years in the UK. And I've included some examples here on this slide. So the first one is Section 28 or Clause 2A, which is what it was termed in Scotland. And this was the notion that from the 1980s in the UK, it was explicitly banned in schools, the teaching of LGBTQ plus lifestyles. And this led to great stigmatization of LGBTQ plus people. It reduced their visibility in education environments, and it really set us back in terms of potential progress and inclusion of LGBTQ plus people. Some promising things that have happened over time is the Equality Act, which cemented the rights of LGBTQ plus people to be protected against discrimination based on their identity. And more recently, there has been the Gender Recognition Act, which is designed to make it easier for trans people to be recognised as the identity that they truly are. However, there are still barriers with these, and if you've seen in the news in recent years, there's been a lot of review of the Gender Recognition Act. There have been proposals to reform it and make the process much more streamlined and straightforward. That has led to a lot of scrutiny of trans identities and has created a lot of toxicity within the LGBTQ plus community as well. And so all of these things are being experienced by our learners as real things that influence and impact their lives. And it's important that we understand them. The final thing is the mental models, and this kind of links to these structural elements too. And we've seen changes and improvements in people's beliefs and attitudes towards LGBTQ plus people over time. But so an example here on the slide is the fact that in 2019, the World Health Organization declared that being transgender was no longer recognized as a disorder. And this plays into narratives around the pathologizing of trans identities and also queer and LGBT identities over time. It's often been seen as something that could be treated or cured, which is really not acceptable now, but we still have those mental models to confront. And then there's also this unfortunate suggestion that there has been a decline in the acceptance of same-sex relationships. So we have made progress, and it's really positive that steps are being taken, but we still have a long way to go. And all of this stuff is really important to be considering when we think about how people are experiencing the university environment. So considering elements of this system in terms of individuals and institutions, questions I would like you to challenge yourself to think about, both as individuals and also for the learners that you support, is it possible to bring your whole self to work and study? Are there people like me where I work and study? Are they reflected in the materials that I work with? And what messages are being sent by my course? And often we don't think about these things in relation to sexuality because you might think of your subject as being not relevant to somebody's sexuality. But in STEM, there are a wealth of examples of representation of queer identities that you could think about, and you could also think about the messages that you're sending with your allyship. Something that a lot of LGBT plus people in higher education experience is something called microaggressions, and this is just a little summary of the kind of things that are often people faced with in this area, and I've broken these down into micro assaults, insults, and invalidations. And these are really sort of a range of attacks that people can experience on a daily basis that are often small in their instance, but over time they build up and they can create quite a negative and hostile environment. And I've slightly reappropriated the concept of why is my curriculum so white, and also challenging you all to think, why is my curriculum so straight? And also to think about how STEM subjects have had a role to play in the oppression of LGBTQ plus people over time, particularly around the pathologization and how heavily medical a lot of our attitudes towards queer identities have been throughout history. And this is something that we really need to change in our STEM subjects. So another thing to highlight here is the fact that in STEM, I think because we have this separation between subject and personality and person, this is often tied to the notion of being a rigorous scientist. So, you know, it doesn't matter who I am, I should be able to do an experiment very cleanly, very rigorously, and professionally. And this has some conflation with the notion of heteronormativity. So this means that, you know, we think of somebody who's a scientist in a very specific way, and it's often, you know, male, white, and straight. And notions of queerness and the connotations that the LGBTQ plus community brings into your mind won't necessarily be correlated with these notions of rigor and professionalism, simply through the kind of messages that we get about the LGBTQ plus community through the media, and potentially in your level of experience with members of the community themselves. If we don't see queer people as scientists, then how do we make the connection between them being people who could be scientists? So this is just a few suggestions that I've made around micro interventions to address the challenges that people experience. And you'll have seen on my slide that I shared my pronouns. This is something I always try to do in the various ways I come into contact with people, be it through my email signature, when introducing myself. So I would say, my name is Katie, my pronouns are she, her. It helps me to be sure that you know how to refer to me. If you want to talk about my presentation today, you can say, she said this, and you wouldn't have any doubt that you were using the correct gendered pronouns for me. It's really beneficial in so many instances, not just with members of the LGBTQ plus community. A lot of people have gender neutral first names, names from different countries that you don't necessarily have the ability to assume the gender of. Effectively, what I'm saying is don't assume, and normalize sharing the practice. A small thing you can do is demonstrate a level of allyship by using certain symbols to represent your connection or understanding of the community. So you'll notice that I'm wearing a rainbow lanyard. This is part of the Staff Pride Network's efforts to raise the visibility of LGBTQ plus staff, and also create allyship within the wider university community. But it's really important that you know what this means. So why have I got a rainbow? What does the rainbow stand for? It's not just about pretty colours. And again, here I've said about not making assumptions. These are micro things that you can do on an individual level that are really beneficial. And we're seeing these kind of things happen more commonly at conferences and things like that aren't just focused on equality. I've been to a recent immunology conference that was very good on ensuring people shared their pronouns when introducing themselves, and not making assumptions about people's identities. This section is more around the kind of macro interventions that you could be making if you have more power in your organization, and sort of thinking about how these fit in to the different levels of change that are possible. So data monitoring, like I pointed out earlier, there's a real lack of data in understanding the experiences of LGBTQ plus learners. We don't necessarily ask the question. We don't give the opportunity to learn. And so if we have ways of doing this confidentially or anonymously, it helps us to really improve our understanding of how LGBTQ plus people are experiencing our communities and our learning organizations. The analysis of the data is also really crucial. So while we might collect information in these discrete categories, it's really important that you create ways of thinking about how identities intersect and overlap. you know, I'm not just a queer woman, I'm a queer white woman. I'm neurotypical and able-bodied, which means I have a very different experience of the world than a disabled white woman who isn't queer. So all of these aspects of my identity intersect and change the way I experience the cultures that I operate in. And I think it's important that we challenge ourselves to understand this. And, you know, in STEM, we understand data and we think about data a lot of the time, but we don't necessarily think about people's experiences in the qualitative angle too. So it's really vital that we bring this dimension in. Training is vital, and, you know, you're all here today having these, receiving these presentations, learning and engaging with opportunities is really crucial to expand your knowledge and understanding. Support, safety and visibility is really crucial too. So think about whether you consider the rights and access of LGBT plus people when you plan international work is a great example. It's not safe for many parts of the world to go to if you're a queer person. And while it might be possible to hide who you are, ask yourself if that's really a fair thing to do. Are you asking somebody to go back into the closet in order to get an opportunity that would enhance their career? Maybe reconsider and think, can you make opportunities that are more inclusive and accessible? Resource and networking are really vital as well. So community development is a huge part of things, and you will understand and learn a lot more by joining different communities and resourcing them properly. And finally, aspects around accountability and transparency are really vital. So ideally what we're trying to do is create an environment where bullying and harassment doesn't happen. But if it does, there need to be really clear processes in place. You need to know who to go to and what to do in order to redress these kind of problems that could arise due to the existing preconceptions and problems around the mental models that exist towards the LGBT plus community. So finally, these are just some resources about sort of STEM specific representation of LGBTQ plus people, and I will also add these to the chat while the questions might be coming in. And this is just a reminder at this point, because I'm close to wrapping up. If you do have any questions, anything you'd like me to discuss in more depth, please feel free. We've got a little bit of time before the next session. So I'm directly involved in the STEM Village, as I mentioned. And we do a number of theme-specific seminars on different disciplines in STEM, which are aiming to platform the research of LGBTQ plus researchers. And the next year is the 2022 LGBTQ STEMinar, which is taking place in Glasgow. And that's being co-hosted by the STEM Village and colleagues of mine at STEM Equals Project, which is based at Strathclyde University. So that's a really great opportunity to come and see where people, what people are doing in terms of scientific research and see the representation of LGBTQ plus people. So finally, I challenge you today to make a plan. What are you going to do with the information that I've been giving you today? Think about, you know, I am going to do this, by when, and what outcome are you looking for? And so, yes, that's all from me. And are there any questions? I will stop sharing my screen for a moment.
Thank you very much, Katie. You've packed an awful lot of stuff into that 20 minutes, so congratulations for that. And and it'll be great to go back to the slides afterwards. So a few questions coming in. I'll just pick up on one of the ones just came in just there. So should there be mandatory training for staff and students about these issues? And if so, how could we go about getting departmental or school or whatever buy-in? And also any particular training you'd recommend is my other add-on question to that. But what are your thoughts about the training and making it mandatory, and any recommendations?
It's a very good question. I'll speak to the topic of mandatory first of all, because that's something I've been working on directly through my work in the School of Chemistry. So one of the things that I think is very crucial, and when we're thinking about the sort of making this systemic rather than, you know, we just want to make people feel better who have had bad experiences. If we make things mandatory, it helps to mainstream things, and it can be useful to think about existing models where training is mandatory and why it is. So in chemistry, what we've done is we've looked at the fact that health and safety training is mandatory. Everybody needs to know how to safely operate in a chemistry lab. using that model, we've said, well, everybody should know how to contribute to a positive research culture. So we've designed a similar 1-hour training session that everybody in the school will have to attend, and their attendance will be recorded. And then we also include signals to demonstrate sort of personal agency as to why you might benefit from that training. Because I think just making it mandatory without a reason, you often get resistance because people think, oh, I'm only doing this because somebody's told me to. Whereas, and that you get that rhetoric with health and safety training, it's like, oh, I've got common sense, I kind of know. But if you also say, look, your lab is going to prosper if you do the health and safety training, then it can be helpful in generating that kind of buy-in. So yes, I think it would be great if there was mandatory training. I think it would be good as the other element of the training in chemistry is that we make it regular. So even if you've been there for 5 years, you revisit this content annually. And even though it might be the same content or giving you a refresher, it's still pointing you in directions or maybe helping to cement areas that you're like, oh yeah, no, I know that very well. Or it might bring up an area that you don't know so well. So yeah, that's my perspective on those things.
That's great. Another question here. Do you think it's a good idea for people to adopt using kind of they and their so as to avoid inadvertent wrong assumptions? What are your views on that?
It's a very good question. And I think, so for me, habitually, it's something I've started doing personally. When I don't know somebody's pronouns, my perspective is it's safer to say they or them because I know that isn't wrong one way or the other. I would also say, if I was doing it and talking to somebody and I had face to face, I might mention it and say, I realize I'm using they and them, please correct me if I'm wrong. Because actually most people I've noticed aren't bothered if you say they or them when that's not necessarily their pronouns. But somebody will be very offended if you assume at the opposite end of the supposed binary, for example. And if somebody's pronouns are they, and you use that as the default, it's very welcoming. And I've started you notice it's very useful training, particularly if you're doing recruitment. So in theory, if you've got somebody's CV and you only have their name, you do naturally make assumptions. And that is a thing I think we just need to train ourselves out of, and we're very capable of doing this. Is thinking, okay, this is just a somebody and it is a they. And actually, it is something that's quite natural. People come up with some resistance around using they as a singular pronoun because it doesn't feel natural in sort of normal English. But if you think about a great example colleagues of mine always use is from the Bake Off. There's the blind testing challenge where they're talking about people's products and they don't know who's done what. So they'll be saying things like, oh yes, this baker, they've done this. They've left their pie in for too long. And that they're talking about one baker. They're not talking about a group of bakers. So it's not impossible. So yeah, I would definitely suggest that personally. But I welcome anyone to challenge me on that as well.
Okay, no, thanks for that. There's another question here about, do you have any suggestions about how to support LGBTQ plus students for like workplaces in countries where their safety could be compromised?
Yes, so there are a few resources around this that are very useful. First of all, your individual university should have like a global development department. I think at Edinburgh University, we call it Edinburgh Global, and they ought to have policies and procedures around supporting staff wherever they might go and what their identity is and what the laws are and things around that country. The other more overarching resource available in the UK is Stonewall has a model for how organisations might wish to operate in countries where it is not safe for LGBTQ plus people. And there's different levels of this. So there is the sort of first stage, which is effectively you obey the laws in that country. And so for LGBTQ plus people, the recommendation would be go back in the closet. Now, personally, I don't support that. And so I think we should be really critical of whether or not you should actually create a work placement in a country in the first place, if it's not a country that will be safe for all students. So yeah, reconsider would be my recommendation around that. The next stage is whether there are opportunities for what's called a sort of it's kind of like an embassy model. So the notion would be you go to a place in that country and the place like the company that you work in itself is safe and welcoming. But as soon as you leave that building or that special area of the country, you're then not safe. So it's kind of a step up. And then the final model is being a sort of advocate ambassador role, where your presence as an organization, or you're sending groups there in order to try and shift the dial in how that country has attitudes towards LGBTQ+ people. Now that has considerations around, colonialism and whether we should be trying to influence the laws and the regimes of other countries. So I think there's a real sensitivity around that, but there should be a lot of resources available too. So yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through all the other questions, but maybe if you get a chance, Katie, you might be able to respond to some of them within the chat. And I see Lara's getting ready in the background here, which is great. So just thank you very much. It was like a jam-packed session that you gave us there. And Lara, I will hand over to you just whenever you're ready. And thank you very much for joining with us.
No problem. Hello everyone, my name's Lara Lalemi. It's actually, I just wanted to say thank you to Katie, because actually I, as a queer person myself, I rarely get to hear about queerness within science other than coming from my own mouth, which can get tiresome sometimes, I assure you, or people around me assure me anyway. So anyway, hello, I'm Lara Lalemi. I'm a third-year PhD student from the University of Bristol. And I'm here today to talk to you about innovating STEM. And yes, this is in terms of race, but also it could be used as a model for many different marginalized communities. So in today's formula, we're going to be looking at what we teach, how we teach, and what you can do. So how supporting students is supporting their mental health. And so one of the first questions I want to ask you is, why did you stay in STEM? Why did you go into STEM in the first place, but also why did you stay within STEM? It's a really important question to ask. So, okay, I want to first address the statistics, and this is the population of 2011, and since then we have done a consensus this year. But if we were to compare the population sizes with some of the groups in which we have within STEM, you can see that STEM can seem fairly representative. Unrepresentative for people with disabilities, but that is a separate conversation, and I do wish to address that in the future, but not today. But with the BME and LGBTQ+ communities, it does seem to be representative. Although in a survey done by the APPG, 29% of LGBT+ people didn't feel like they were comfortable or had considered leaving their jobs. So there's still contention there. But in terms of race, again, it's still fairly representative. So where's the problem? Well, if you actually look at it, BME students in universities are less likely than their white counterparts to graduate with a first or 2-1. They're more likely to feel a lack of sense of belonging and or satisfaction in higher education. And they are less likely to complete their first undergraduate degree. Now, to me, a lot of these problems can be to do with mental health and support and a sense of belonging within the university. And it's really important that we explore that. Now, as you know, I said I was a PhD student, and it's taken me a lot of work and a lot of people to get me here. And so part of the reason why my mental health was improved throughout university, and I can only really talk about it in terms of myself as a Black queer woman, but it was through the supportive academic and non-academic staff, because they're both equally important to universities. It was therapy, mentors, and lastly, decolonizing my mind. Now, decolonizing my mind is a subject that I'm actually going to talk to you about today because it's really important, and it's to do with the curriculum change. So reforming the curriculum to me means decolonizing the curriculum, and it also means innovating the curriculum. It means widening the data set without lowering the data quality. It means expanding what we learn in order to, again, not only address historically what's happened and come before us, but what could come in the future. But just to explain, I know what does decolonization mean, or decolonizing science mean, because you may have come across this term, but because it's a recent buzz term, but it's not always evidently clear what it means. So it can refer to a number of things. So that can mean student and staff diversity, ED&I, student awards and achievement, curricula and pedagogy, which is what we're going to be kind of talking about today, and research and knowledge production. But from what I have found, and through my experiences of running decolonisation workshops across the UK, is it's fundamentally about what we teach. So as I said before, the curriculum, how we teach it, and who we teach and who we teach with. Those are really important factors. And I will touch on each of these subjects, but mainly I will talk about what we teach and how we teach. So what we teach. So now there is three main curriculums which we teach in schools or education systems. The first is the explicit curriculum. This is what we provide students as like module frameworks, prescribed readings, and assessment guidelines. There's the hidden curriculum. This is what students learn from the dominant culture that isn't explicitly told to them. It's something they learn. So gender stereotypes is what they kind of can learn without being explicitly told. This is what, say, a binary man or cis man does, and this is what a cis woman does. And then there's the null curriculum, which is what universities and education systems leave out, what is not taught, what is not discussed, and what is not learned. So one can argue that when we teach, it's very important, namely to address the content, the visibility within that content, and the relatability of the curricula, so that we can engage students and so we don't lose students in the midst of our education system. And also in doing this, we could actually have an impact on students' mental health. For me, the lack of relatable content within my topics and the representative figures led me to be disengaged with my subject of chemistry. I still find it hard to realize where it can take me, how I can relate, and how I can change the world through using my chemistry knowledge. But the reason why I'm here today is because of my mentors encouraged me to where I am today, and encouraged me that I was good enough, and encouraged me that I could use chemistry for good and for social change. And they were right, but it was because of that encouragement that I'm here today. And throughout school, the lack of representation and relatable content really did lead to feelings of inferiority, and that kind of led to me wanting to decolonize my mind, because I felt that what had Black people contributed to the sum of knowledge? Like, for me, I didn't see anyone that looked like me. So for me, I felt like I was dumb. I was born like stupid, which is stupid to think about, but I just didn't think I was clever enough to ever do a PhD. I remember thinking that to myself. Well, I proved myself wrong, thank God for that. But that is one of the things that really was going through my mind. So if we take the chemistry curriculum, how can we adapt it to be more relevant and relatable and engaging to the next generation of students? Now, one example that I've found throughout my research was social justice. It was the inclusion of social justice. So just to kind of explain, what is social justice? To put it simply, it's the idea that all people, regardless of race, sex, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, or ability, should have equal benefits and opportunities in life. Particularly groups which suffer from disadvantage and discrimination from society may be expected to actually suffer from high rates of mental health illness. However, if we were to look at our courses, large real-world issues of social justice, health, and environment are somewhat missing within the chemistry curriculum. And so introducing this might actually not only decolonize the curriculum, but actually encourage students to pursue and continue on pursuing chemistry because they know its social implications. And one I thought interesting point was to make is a study conducted in the Pennsylvania State University examined that the transformative social justice education received by the Black alumni, they did a report on this, and what it showed was that by including social justice into the science curriculum, the students were allowed to self-explore what was important to them, and it altered their sense of justice, and it influenced their ideas of self-identity and how their placement was, their positionality in the world. And that's so important. Imagine what that could do to your mental health, because I think what we've got to realize is there is a difference when you grow up, say, as a Black person in a majority Black country to a Black person in a majority white country. There are things that you learn when you're in a majority white country that isn't necessarily indicative of your race, but it's something that you learn as well, bad tropes as part of your race. And then when you actually unlearn and you become better positioned in your mind, in your world, in science, it actually leads to a better understanding of yourself and also your place. So another study that actually integrated this was this one, where they connected chemistry with social science. And I won't go into it too much. I will leave you to look this up. But one of the quotes I found interesting was that chemistry for social justice can be used as an effective guide to educate and enable students to make use of knowledge and skills of exercising empathy. It allows for students to not only cohesively work together, to explore their curriculum, to challenge their curriculum, it allows them to also challenge society and let that feed into how their perspective of their degree. Another example is here. So it's done in South Africa. And what they did was they developed a socially just framework with lecturers, educators. The whole point of this, the issue with decolonising science is the fact that it's not an issue that's just for scientists or social scientists. It's an issue that we all need to tackle together. And so therefore what this study did was it brought together all the people that were going to be affected by the decolonisation scheme, and they asked for their opinions, they asked for their feedback. So another thing that they did is they wanted to, through interviews, introduce her to kind of a change or a mix-up of the traditional curriculum, but it didn't mean taking away any white or Eurocentric parts. It just meant enriching the curriculum that it already had with more social justice and environmental information. And so there are these other things, but I won't concentrate on those today. So just to explore, why is it important? It's important because students need to see representatives that they can aspire to be. I may not have people who are in chemistry to look up to, but I've had mentors, and I have even my mother who I can look up to, who are strong Black women in science. And that is so important, and it's more important than we give credit to. So students, how they relate, it can help in how students relate to the degree. So currently in science, we're actually finding it harder and harder to retain students, especially from minority groups. Maybe if we adapted it in a way of bringing social justice into our topics, and this could be something that you have thought of as an educator and think, oh, I can add that into my slides, maybe at the end. It's a really good suggestion to think about your own slides, think about your own courses, whatever you teach, and think about integrating yourself as well as the world and global issues into that. And again, it's because of that connection of between students and staff, you get reduced isolation and improved sense of belonging. Again, so I'm just going to address the how we teach, and this was done by Dr. Neil Williams from Nicoll University, who works with me on the decolonising science curriculum, which we do cater for across the UK. And so the three main changes that they made was the introduction to problem-based learning, and active learning. They use online laboratory work, pre-labs and classes, and they use more authentic and accessible assessment. They also, in their laboratory work, they use different kinds of forms of ways to educate students about the labs. So that means introducing demonstration labs, videos and computer simulations, smart work sheets. And if you're doing these things, that's excellent. That's something that needs to be implemented across science. But also changing the class time so that the students who are commuting in would have more time. And this is significant because, again, having time to commute and to rest and to feel to have that gap, and especially can help students. So one of the interesting things was that the introduction of a more expansive way of teaching and active learning. So just to define, active learning is a method of learning in which students are actively or experimentally involved in the learning process. So they found that actually active learning led to a narrowing of achievement gaps. So that's the attainment gap that has been that's proliferated throughout media. And so just to say here, so they went from a minus 14.3% to a 10%. Now, I'm not saying that this data, we need to do more studies around this topic of how to improve the attainment gap, but if even a little part of what they did had a real big effect, it's important that we do observe it and we do try to implement some of the changes that they made into our own practices. And so again, how we teach, there are benefits. It increases student staff communication, and there's an improvement in student confidence and engagement. But also, now that I've explored how we teach and what we teach, it's also important to explain one thing that's non-curriculum based that I thought would be quite a fun thing to explain, because it was a project that I was part of. Actually, I started, and actually this is one of the best allies I've ever had in the university, called Professor Fred Manby. And the idea was that in our university, all we do is see pictures of white cis males who have achieved great things. And that, while that is fantastic, it's not representative of the students that are actually walking the halls. I wanted, and so what I did was going into chemistry, which is a massive hall, which hundreds of students used to pre-COVID walk past, and we put up a board. This board was of international Bristol scientists who happened to be BME. And I think that's an important factor for you to identify with. They happen to be BME. And because they were all fantastic people doing fantastic work and cutting edge science. And what was important about this board was that it allowed young students who actually told us that they felt seen and they felt visible for one of the first times. Now I have a whole presentation that can explore all the different methods that I've used to increase the diversity and inclusivity at our university, but that isn't the talk today. But I just wanted to show you that it's not just about the curriculum, it's about your environment as well. It's about what learning environment are you creating for young people to inspire them, to engage with them, and to also allow them to innovate science themselves and feel autonomous over it. So I'm just going to conclude with some of my top tips for being the change that you want to see, because we're all about that. So I'm very keen on exploring the fact that there is no wrong door. There's been many times where I have thought, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to start. I don't know where to start. But sometimes just starting and getting it wrong is absolutely fine, because you learn from your mistakes, as you know. But the top tips that I would say is conduct surveys or workshops of staff and students about the curriculum, but not just the curriculum, also the environment that you're within. Ask them what they feel about like how they're studying, where they're studying, and who's teaching them. It's good to get the lay of the land, I feel. Otherwise, how do you know what to improve on? Second is connect with social scientists. I feel like there's such a gulf between us and social, well, I say us as being scientists. If there's any social scientists in the crowd, I do apologize, but you're also scientists too. But yeah, there's a massive disconnect between what is being talked about decolonization in terms of social science and the implementation in actual science. And I wish to be the bridge between that gap. So obviously I can't be everywhere. So you have geography departments and social educational departments. Connect with them, find out how you think you can adapt your course, take your course to them, and kind of talk with them about what you do. Participate in decolonizing science workshops, namely mine if you want to, but also other ones. And there's talks on Eventbrite all the time about decolonizing science. And a lot of people think, well, for me especially, that what I'm doing in terms of the workshop is massive and it's monumental. I only started this 3 years ago, and although I've been learning very intently and intensely, that's it, not intently, intensely over the last 2 years, I'm still not an expert, and neither do you have to be. But it's important that you stay informed and you understand the new terms and ways of innovating science. And again, like I said, look at your own course and environment and analyze what you're bringing to your university. What are you bringing to young students? And my very, very top tip is consider becoming a mentor. these are all of my mentors. They have helped me get to university. They have encouraged me. Namely, Chris was my personal tutor, Chris Russell, Dr. Chris Russell. And he was the first person to look at me and say, you're intelligent, like you're good enough to do a PhD. I don't know why you don't feel like you are. And I think through his encouragement and his words is the only reason why I've actually gotten to where I am today. So much so that each of them have really encouraged me in starting my own organization called Creative Tuition Collective. Now, this is looking at widening the goalpost, but without lowering the bar. So it's another adaptation of the earlier quote. But it really does look at providing free tuition, extracurricular workshops, and also mental health support to young people, because we recognize that both just improving someone's grades isn't good enough. It's also considering their mental health, their stress levels, their anxiety levels. All of that is really important to creating a well put together young person or student, no matter what age they are. So we're really enthusiastic about helping younger people in schools, but also with connecting with universities, and we're looking for partners across the UK. So that's inspired me. So I want to leave you with, again, why did you stay in science? What made you stay there? Was it family encouragement? Was it self-encouragement, self-preservation as well? You need a lot of that. What was it? And think about that, and then think about how you can ensure more people stay in science. And so one thing I wanted to leave you with is that we all can be engines of change. We can all make tiny little changes that can affect the big picture. And so I want to leave you with a quote from one of my favorite people. Not that he was my friend, but there you go. I wish. But James Baldwin, who was a Black queer man, who said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. Be that change that you want to see." Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Lara. Again, a very full presentation, lots of things for us to think about.
You asked for it.
Yeah, I did ask for it, and then you gave me it. Thanks very much. So we've got time for a few questions, thankfully. That's good. So a question that I've got here is, so you mentioned about, running workshops and getting people together and talking, absolutely. And everyone's at different starting points. So what would be some key starting questions, that we might want to put to any workshop groups to, like, co-create with staff and students? Any kind of questions we might want to put to people to get the ball rolling on it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. So within my workshop, the Decolonizing Science workshop, we asked just the fundamental questions of, why would you decolonize science? Like, what does it mean to you? Because it is a personal thing, and I think often people think it's, again, this monumental thing that you have to do, but it's so personal. It's to do with you and your past and what you want to achieve. So I'd ask why even do it? What would you want to achieve with it? And also, one of the questions that we ask, or let me just think, is where do you begin? So at what point? So say if we're doing geography, so we're doing a geography with St. Andrews on Wednesday. And so what part of the geography and sustainability development course, where can you decolonize it? Where can you start? And often it's asking, where can I start realistically? And then expanding from that, because you don't have to start with the whole thing, maybe just a small minute course or lecture slide or something like that you can change. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, and it's kind of linked in a way, actually. My next question, you were mentioning about the research that was done on the active learning, and there were lots of things that they put in place that then resulted in decreasing the attainment gaps. Were there any things in particular, do you remember, from that research that were more impactful than others?
From what I think it's just the active learning was one of the biggest things, because it was BME students responded the most towards the active learning. So throughout what they did is they made sure that the students was always involved. And so even though it was very hard to implement, I think that's what was the biggest takeaway. I think, again, the research on that is still being done, and the problem is, again, more departments, more universities need to conduct the same research so that we know what actually can affect change. But the problem is not many universities are doing that, so we haven't been able to collect enough data in order to show conclusively that active learning does really help, or say laboratory times changing. Like it's still a work in progress.
And I know that you do training yourself, but I know that you can't be everywhere at the same time.
I cannot.
So are there other kind of training opportunities that you know of that people could tap into to get started?
Very good question. Eventbrite is my friend, and I use it as a training resource because it is free most of the time. So I would look to just get you started. YouTube and Eventbrite are great. YouTube for TED Talks. TED Talks are one of the most informative things about just understanding a topic in its basic sense, because it has to be in its basic sense. And then again, the Eventbrite attends events that you wouldn't necessarily have gone to. I attended an event in Boston, completely different to what we do, but it's so I could learn about the technology and what they're improving on and what's their cutting edge science. So you can expand in that way, but also there are loads of freelance people that are working on the same thing. Like I would suggest maybe going to talk to maybe some social scientists and to look them up. I often Google people that I read papers of. So I Google their names and I email them and say, can I have a quick chat with you about what you've said here? And often they say yes. And that's a really great way to start, because it starts a conversation and it allows you a chance to ask questions.
Yeah, that's a good point. And now that we're all kind of stuck online most of the time, it makes it easier, I think, for people to say yes and catch a meeting with people in other parts of the world, which is great.
Exactly.
Yeah,
just got to bear in mind the time difference.
Of course. and related to that, you mentioned about TED Talks and Eventbrite, etc. Any recommended reading is another question coming through as well.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So what I will do is I will send to Heather and the organizers all my recommended reading. I don't like to put it in my slides because it can inundate people and you never get down everything, even if you screenshot. And so I can send you a list of readings that I kind of went through, and it will talk about decolonizing science, race. I'm sure Katie has the LGBT references, but I have some of those as well. So I can put together a list for you so you don't feel so alone or like, where do I start? Don't worry about it. We're here to support you. That's the whole point of this. We're here to support you and your vision, as long as you have one.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, I'm always aware of the clock ticking away here. So I would just like to say a massive thank you to both Katie and Lara for joining with us, giving us fantastic jam-packed presentations. And just to remind people that all the resources will be made available and the recording of the session on the Collaborative Cluster webpage. So you can, you can see it on the screen there, you can type it into Google. Just thank you everyone for joining with us today. And we'll be having our next webinar on the 10th of May. So hopefully we'll see you then. We'll get the Eventbrite link sent out soon. So just thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for now.